The GOP is making a push for tax reform as they begin to organize the legislative push for a new bill. Welcome to a special webisode of Talking Points. I'm Josh Carney. The push for tax reform has been the focal point of the fiscal conservative agenda under this administration. The Trump team, coupled with Republican leadership, have put together a framework for a bill that prioritizes key issues that the president campaigned on, as well as key ideals that conservatives have prioritized for years. Talking Points contributors Dan Prager, Gilat Melamed, and Byron Tollefson are here to break down this bill's path to the floor and the looming fight over what legislation will eventually look like. Everyone, thank you for being here.
Love to be here.
We're going to kick it right off. How did this framework come to be?
Well, the GOP has always been looking to change taxes. They see the system as broken. I mean, if you remember the 2016 election, you're seeing all of the candidates from Ted Cruz to Donald Trump to John Kasich offering these new and different ways to reform the tax code. Trump won. His way is going to be the way that goes. But they've always kind of seen this as something that needs to be fixed, something that's overstuffed, way too complicated, something that needs to be simplified.
Byron, how did this framework get here?
How did the framework get here? Well, the main goal or one of the main goals of this presidency is getting tax reform done. And as you talked about, there haven't been a lot of major legislative achievements with this presidency. And this is one thing that a lot of conservatives can get behind. But as we've seen already, there's been a split in the House and the Senate between moderates and conservative figures. Conservatives wanting more to be done on taxes, even bigger tax cuts, and moderates saying we don't want the tax cuts to be done anymore because the deficit could eventually rise.
It's not just moderates and conservatives. You have moderates, conservatives, moderate conservatives, libertarians. All of these different factions, different groups want different things, and that's why it's so hard for Republicans to really get things done, and why it was so hard to get this tax bill all set together in the first place.
Right, and with so many different players and eventually going to be so much congestion within this bill, Gilat, what are the key priorities that the GOP and the Trump administration are trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, cutting the two big things, you have the individual side of it and you have the corporate side. On the individual side, it's a combination of lowering taxes, but also simplification. They're taking it from 7 tax rates to 3, so there's the simplification, lowering the top one from down to 35% from 39.6. And then on the corporate side, you have going from 35% corporate tax rates to 20% corporate tax rates. So it's a dual simplification and lowering of the tax rate.
And so the overarching objective of this bill, Byron, is to both not only accomplish those, but what else do you think the GOP is seeking to define?
Well, what they want to have here is, with a lot of stuff we talk about taxes, is growth. And Trump has already come out and said growth is already at 2% right now. This bill is going to have 3% or more. With these 3 tax rates, you have 35, 25, and 12. We've had some conservatives like Mark Meadows, the chairman of the far-right House Freedom Caucus, say if this tax cut goes anything above 20%, I'm not voting for it. So that's a potential roadblock.
And how can this growth fundamentally be ensured if we're going to cut taxes and we're going to not ensure revenue?
Well, it can't.
Yeah.
They don't have a plan to pay for it. So this is really just half a bill, unless you're assuming they're just going to keep the deficit huge, which obviously are not.
And that breakdown for cuts, not only in individual tax rates but corporate tax rates, is that the only thing that is strikingly different about this GOP bill approach as compared to past tax reform fights?
Definitely not. I mean, you're definitely seeing more of a tax cut than from the Obama administration. But yeah, you do have this focus, like I was saying, on simplification. You're seeing that 7 to 3. You're seeing taxes get lowered. They're really focusing on that idea that I was talking about before. The tax code is overstuffed. Let's make it easier. Let's make it better for the people instead of having all of these different clauses. And it could be argued that they're not doing everything they can because they still have all those clauses, but they're working on their first plan to kind of shorten it.
Now, in terms of shortening it or maybe streamlining their approach, there's projected $1.5 trillion worth of both corporate and individual tax cuts. Yeah. How can they go with those cuts, ultimately not ensure growth, and be able to come out on top in terms of this bill, Gilat?
Well, they want to do tax breaks, and they're saying by having getting rid of the corporate tax breaks, you could still lower the tax, and it won't get rid of the deficit completely. There'll still be an increase in the deficit, but it's kind of a way to lessen the effects. And if you wanted to break even kind of on the deficit and with the corporate tax rates, you could lower the corporate tax to 26%, not 20%, but you would have to get rid of all tax breaks, which is, obviously that's not realistic and it would never happen.
But in the case of all these cuts, and we see both individuals and corporate playing a role, how is the GOP identifying their priority here in terms of growth? Do they think one will lead to the other? Do they think one will move faster in the more right direction that they would like to see?
I think their idea is that by cutting taxes on the rich and even getting rid of an estate tax, which is also known as the death tax, which when families pay for a house or ranch, over $5.49 million is passed down to here, that's gone. And I think they think by cutting all these taxes on the rich, they'll be able to help the economy going. The big business will be able to get more industry.
But if we're still
it's a return to trickle down.
Yeah.
But if we're also looking at estate taxes in comparison to major shifts in terms of the fundamental tax bracket, are we eventually going to get to a bill that is full and complete that the GOP would want?
Eventually, that's what they're hoping for. This bill, as it stands, it's not going to pass. You're already seeing fights on the estate tax. Some mild part of this bill that isn't really a major part of it.
And it affects the estate tax, affects such a small part of the population.
It's not that politically viable to get rid of it. And then you're seeing something where they're increasing taxes on the lowest class, which, I mean, may just be an image issue. They have other things on this standard deduction. But how politically viable is it to say, all right, we're going to take the lowest class and increase your taxes, while the upper class, you get decreased? It's an image thing, and it's a terrible look for them.
And ultimately, for a bill that is prioritizing cuts and taking less money in, how are budget hawks ultimately going to get on the same page as the leadership in terms of being able to vote for this bill?
Well, I think it's going to be a great test to see of which budget hawks are going to stay to their foundation. I mean, we've had Bob Corker, a Tennessee Republican senator, who said he's not running again in 2018. He's saying if the bill increases the deficit by 1 penny, he's not voting for it.
And he can say that.
He can say that because he's not running, but that's a very key vote. And going on to if this bill has any chance of going through the Senate, you have Corker not on it, you have the moderates Susan Collins not on it, and you have Lisa Murkowski, John McCain, any of them, this bill's doomed, just like we saw with healthcare.
If Corker says no, they're out. If one member of the Freedom Caucus says no, probably all of them are out. If Rand Paul goes, the Libertarians are out. You have so many options for failure here. It's really hard as this fractured Republican Party to bring everyone together and get every single person what they want.
In terms of bringing everybody in together, though, you'd have to see sort of a winnowing down of this bill. Do you think eventually, because it has to go through without error, as being such a comprehensive bill, that we will eventually see a scaling down of some of the objectives?
I think eventually you will, because you have to, and I think it's come to a point where the Trump administration and Republicans in general are so desperate for a big legislative win. We're coming up on a year of this, the Trump administration already, and I think out of desperation they will be able to compromise. Maybe if you add in that 4th tax bracket at the top to get some more revenue in to help the deficit not go as low. Just compromises like that, it's going to be imperfect, but ultimately they have to say, do they want what we have now, or what eventually will be imperfect, but
now, as we talk about that future perspective, what would be your final take moving forward of where you see the projection of this tax reform bill, not only getting to the floor, but eventually being debated and legislated on?
I think eventually it will go through. I think it'll kind of be what we saw with Obamacare, where it'll go to the floor. I think it won't go to the floor, then they'll revise it. It'll go to the floor, maybe they'll get a no vote, but I think eventually they will be able to come to something, and I think it might have to be, adding in that top tax bracket, maybe not lowering the corporate tax all the way down to 20%, maybe when looking at some of the tax breaks and itemized deductions, and just minor things, but if you do a bunch of minor things like that with itemized deductions, tax breaks, it will add up, and I think eventually they will be desperate enough and it will go through.
Absolutely. Byron, your take?
Well, the GOP will certainly hope that it goes past the Senate. In my opinion, I think it goes to the Senate, not a lot of contention before that, but I think this divide in the Republican Party that we're going to keep seeing between the heavy conservatives in the Freedom Caucus in the House, but even moderates in the GOP Senate, I don't see this going through. I see a very similar dynamic taking place that happened with healthcare. Maybe they'll be like, okay, we need to get an achievement done, but at this point, especially with Corker coming out against it and him saying that now he can perform his most meaningful public service in the next 15 months because he's been running for re-election, a vote against taxes, and they're pretty much done.
Right. Dan, what do you think is next?
I'm going to split the difference between the two of you and say I have no idea. Because, simple as it is, the bill as it is now, as I said before, it's not going through. And what you guys are arguing is that these differences, these changes that are going to be made are going to affect it in a way that you're going to get enough people on board or more people will defect. And honestly, I'm leaning a little more toward it will cause more defections, especially as you see the Trump administration do what they did with healthcare, try to get Murkowski, Collins, and other vulnerable senators like that on by kind of adding special provisions for their state. You were talking about that before the show. I think that'll happen, and I think a lot more moderate things are going to come into this bill. But honestly, I have no idea, because this bill as it is not going to look anything like the final product. So we really don't know what that's going to look like, if that's popular enough to go through. I can't say that I know.
Let's see.
Thank you all for your insights, something that we're definitely going to be paying attention to as we move forward. Tax reform's path to the floor is going to be contentious. The GOP needs the win and wants the win, but if the Trump administration and Republican leadership cannot get on the same page and cannot get a bill to the floor, the future for tax reform under this leadership will be bleak. That's all the time we have. Thanks for tuning into this webisode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for clips and full-length episodes. For all of us here at Talking Points, I'm Josh Carney.